Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see so many familiar and lots of new faces today on what is the first of our CQC webinar series for 2025. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dr. Claire Sieber. I'm a GP and I'm Chief Medical Officer of the Well-Led Provider and Redmore Health. And today's webinar is an update for you on the most recent CQC changes, and then our former CQC inspector is going to answer some sort of questions on juicy subjects, what we feel are juicy subjects anyway, about proportionality, bias, inconsistency and subjectivity that we often feel happens during CQC inspections. And we will also take the opportunity to answer questions that you've submitted in advance. But please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat bar, and we will either answer them during the webinar, or if we run out of time or we don't know the answer, we will get back to you privately, personally by email afterwards. This will be recorded, and the recording and the slides will be sent to you afterwards. So no need to take screenshots. You can just sit back and listen, knowing that you'll get all of the information afterwards to peruse in your own time. Next slide, please, Claire. Thank you. At the very end of the presentation, I will then very quickly introduce you to what we offer at the Well-Led Provider, and then I will introduce you to our colleagues at the Medicines Management team, and they will talk through what they offer to practices and PCNs. And it's because of them and their sponsorship of the webinar series that this is able to be free to all of the people watching today. So thank you to them. Next slide, please, Claire. Just a reminder for those of you who are new to us, that we last year recorded a whole series all about the well-led part of CQC, where we broke down each quality statement, presented you with evidence from recent CQC reports of what was good and what wasn't good enough, and basically unpicked each quality statement. And that whole webinar series, the recordings and the slides can also be accessed through that link if you click on it once you get the slides through. We also did a free webinar about CQC incorporation and the things that you might need to consider, PCN incorporation and the things you might need to consider if your PCN wants to become a limited company. The link to that is there. And we also did a webinar about leadership challenges, which you can access there too. Next slide, please, Claire. What I'll do is I'll let Gary introduce himself briefly now, as he'll be doing some of the Q&A later. And then I'll let Gary hand over to Gabby, who will introduce herself and then start taking you through the slides.
Yeah,
thanks,
hi
Gary.
everybody. Hi everybody. I'm an associate of the Well-Led practice, have been for a couple of years. I'm an ex-practice manager, so I spent 13 years as a practice manager at a large training practice, and I now support practices, PCNs and federations with a variety of things around leadership and business and management. Thank you.
Right, and then I think if we move on to the next slide, please, and we'll start with the I think the next slide as well. Thank you. Perfect, here we go. So thanks everyone for joining. And for those of you who don't know me, my name's Gabby, and as Claire mentioned, I'm a former CQC inspector and now also an associate with the Well-Led Provider, so supporting with anything CQC related queries, mock inspections, and of course these webinars. This slide here, you'll be, for those of you who joined last year, you'll be familiar with the format where we run through data each month just to give you a quick snapshot of what's going on across GP practices and also care homes, because we know we have quite a few adult social care providers on the webinar as well. This data was captured today, so slight caveat, obviously the end of the month is in 2 days' time, so it's not 100% reflective, but it's reflective of what's been published in the month so far, so across the last few weeks of February. And we will not be shocked, as we haven't been last year, to see that adult social care is being inspected at a much higher rate than healthcare, and also that the percentage of outstanding services remains low, but positively there's one, which is better than none, in their GP practices. So as we go through the webinar today, a little bit of the things that we talk about is always encouraging providers to go onto the CQC website, have a look at reports that have been published, particularly the outstanding ones, and see if you can extract any meaningful data from that you can use to either drive improvement or compare the services that you already offer, so that if you are to have an inspection, you can have that conversation with the CQC inspector and say, we do this and this got outstanding, or we're striving towards achieving this. So there is one out there for you to have a look at this month. If we move on to the next slide, please, we'll go to the good stuff, which is the CQC update. So these slides are quite wordy. Obviously, we won't go through all of it today, but as usual, you will get a copy of them afterwards, so you can read that in a little bit more detail. And you'll be, if you've had a look at the webinars from last year, you'll know that we sort of did an update provide an update that took us to sort of October, November time, when the portal was stopped. The portal is no longer in use, and the sort of other things that sort of came about from the DASH report as well. So we've just done a very quick sort of timeline here for you. Everybody hopefully saw in the news that we had a new chief executive join the CQC early December. So Sir Julian Hartley has joined, and he already seems to be making quite an impact. I wouldn't necessarily say an impact in terms of outcome so far. We have to give him a little bit of time. It's still early days, but he's definitely making himself known and making it really clear what the visions and the values are for the CQC and what his hopes are moving forward. So that's positive now that we have that leadership in place. Other quite important things to note is that the evidence categories have been removed. So the quality statements remain, the 34 quality statements, but you may have recalled that under that there were 6 evidence categories that we all had to demonstrate compliance with. They have been removed, and we're now just looking at the quality statements only, which is positive for many people for many reasons. And then the ratings were based upon scores from the quality statements only, which is good news. The frequency of assessments will depend on the information that the CQC are receiving and the evidence they're collecting. So that's not necessarily new news, but they are reiterating the point that they're moving away from assessing at a single point of time, and will be looking to assess different areas of the single assessment framework and different quality statements on an ongoing basis, which does mean that for providers out there, you could receive an inspection on a specific area only and receive a rating change in one key question, for example, only, or score shifts across quality statements, rather than the traditional comprehensive inspection that we're all used to, and sometimes that we're all hoping for as well. Earlier this year, unfortunately, the CQC advised that there is a backlog of approximately 5,000 safety incidents and hundreds of reports that are stuck or lost in the system. There may be some of you on the call. I've got a couple of clients who had inspections last year, sort of October time, and they're still waiting for their draft report, and we have been advised that they are currently not accessible. So if that's you and you're affected on this call, then we sympathise with you, and the CQC have obviously committed to working on that, but that's their current status quo, so a little bit tricky for them. We've also seen some data to show that in the last 12 months, so since January 2024, just 2,500 inspections were carried out compared to 15,800 made between a previous number between 2019. So you can see obviously that the average, that the inspections are at an all-time low in terms of being carried out, but they're also, the age of an inspection is now approximately 4 years between being re-inspected, which is quite high. For many people who receive sort of good ratings or requires improvements, 4 years is a huge amount of time to wait. We're also seeing quite a backlog, unfortunately, with new registration inspections. So some are still sort of 3-4 years into having been registered before they're receiving their first inspection, although the CQC do commit to doing their first inspection within 12 months of a new registration. So again, hopefully the new chief exec will have some plans in place over the next few months to tackle that backlog for us. And he has openly admitted in February this year in an article that essentially the CQC is not delivering its operational performance, and it's not delivering for people that use services and patients. So there's some, I suppose, from a duty of candour point of view, there's some honesty and openness there, and we'll be watching this space as we move forward. Just this week, there was an article about, so Julian Hartley again talked a little bit about the CQC way. So he's brought together recently, I think it was over 1,000 colleagues, providers and stakeholders to start negotiating, to start hearing feedback and to start understanding what's gone wrong, where they'd like to be and how they're going to get there. And they're calling that the CQC way. It's not too much more detail on that at the moment, but it's just, if you're interested, you want to Google the CQC way and have a look at the articles that have come out, then it might be useful for you to do a bit of reading in that area. I think the main thing, and we always try to say this in these webinars, is that underneath all of this, underneath all of the backlogs and the change in leadership and the change in structure or reports being stuck, anything like that, the fundamental standards and the legislation have not changed. So as providers, we still have a duty to meet the Health and Social Care Act and the registration regulations 2009 as well. So the two key pieces of legislation and the fundamental standards have not shifted. There haven't been any significant amendments to those for years. So no matter what's going on at the top, sort of we have to keep pedaling away underneath to make sure that we're compliant with the fundamental standards and the legislation. So always hold on to that, please. On the next slide, there's just an overview of the CQC and how it's looking now. I won't go into this for you, but it's just available for you. It's essentially an organisational chart for you to have a look at. And for those of you who are dialing in from the healthcare sector, you'll know that an interim chief inspector of healthcare has just been recruited in the last few days. So he will be covering both secondary and specialist and primary and community care. So that's Aidan Fowler. I think he's also the NHS England National Director of Patient Safety. So you may have seen his name pop up in other sort of departments before. So they're making strides to filling any recruitment gaps and hopefully bringing this team structure together. But we won't go into too much detail for that one. So if we move on to the next slide, please, and we're going to get started with the questions that as Claire mentioned, that we've received in advance or that have come up to us, to Gary, to Claire and to myself, or Catan and other members of the well-led provider throughout our CQC work. The first question is proportionality. So what would be an example of an inspector going too far, and what could you do to stop them? So this is obviously, you could talk all day about these topics, but I've tried to to give a snapshot. The word proportionality is really, really important. And actually, when I was an inspector, it was one of our favourite words to use. So hopefully it's not too nauseating, but it's important to hold on to. The CQC do strive and should strive to be fair and proportionate. And mainly they refer to that word when they're talking about enforcement. So if you take a look at their enforcement information and their enforcement processes that they follow, they should only take action that we judge to be proportionate to the circumstance of the individual case. So, for example, if we judge that the provider can improve the service on its own and where the risk to people is not immediate, we aim to work with the provider to improve the standards rather than taking enforcement action. But it is important to remember that proportionality applies to all elements of their work, and we have to recognise that the CQC can only understand so much during a time frame, during a visit, whilst looking at one particular quality statement only. So hopefully you find that they are being proportionate, and if not, we will talk about that when we look at challenging. So some examples that we've seen of an inspector going too far, as we might say. The most common one that we find is when you receive a report and they've reported on a low number of incidents or a low number of staff interviews, but it's been presented in a way that suggests that it's actually the majority. So, for example, they may have spoke to 2 or 3 staff out of a workforce of 25, and they've said staff we spoke to. So they haven't been clear that actually it's a low number of staff, or all of the staff we spoke to told us. And if 3 out of those 25, let's say, have got a negative view of the service, and language such as all of the staff we spoke to, or just the staff we spoke to, had a negative viewpoint, that gives an impression to the public that all of the workforce are unhappy, or that the majority of their findings are reflective of just those small amounts of things that they looked at. So they might look, for example, at your incident reporting. Let's say you've had 100 in the last sort of 18 months, and they look at the last 3 only, and of those 3 they're not yet resolved or not yet closed. They might again say something like, of all of the incidents that we reviewed, or the incident log that's being kept showed that this, or that showed that incidents weren't being closed in a timely manner. To me, that's an example of being disproportionate. And so for you, I think the main thing is to always keep a record of what's happening during an inspection. So, for example, if they are looking at the incident reports and they're talking to you about them, asking questions, what happened here? What were the next steps? What did you do? Make sure that you keep a log of how many they've actually looked at. How many staff have they spoken to? Again, make sure that you're clear in your note taking, or when they provide end of day feedback to you. Okay, you've spoken to 3 nursing staff, 2 GPs, 3 administrative, or the reception team, anything like that, so that when you do receive the report back, you can challenge that if you think that anything's been disproportionate. Another example is where you might find that an inspector is fixated on one particular topic. Now, there is lots of really useful information about bias on the Well-Led provider platform. It's sort of one of those things that you shouldn't see, but we also have to admit that we may not be able to get away from it, because we are all human as inspectors. We might have a particular passion project or an area that we have trained in or studied in. We might have personal or lived experience that unfortunately is a bit of a bugbear in the back of our mind that we're bringing to an inspection without it sort of being, a conscious bias at the front of our mind. So I think the first thing is to just take a breath if you do find that an inspector is focusing a little bit too much on a particular area, and then have that conversation with them and say, we've spent a lot of time this morning looking at one particular area. So if they're looking at significant events, for example, we've spent a lot of time looking at this. We want to show you all these other things that we think we do really well. We want to showcase this. Shall we show you our compliments, our complaints, or do you want to speak to staff? Or, we're having a team meeting this morning, and part of the team meeting we would discuss significant events. So do you want to join that and observe that as well? So I would always say that make the effort to have that conversation with the inspector. Make a real effort to show them other elements of work that you're doing. And if you feel that they are focusing on a particular area, from my experience, the main reason that they would do that, beyond sort of unconscious bias, hopefully, is if they're thinking about enforcement action. So if they are concerned that there is a breach, that you're not demonstrating compliance in a particular area, let's use significant events as an example. So your policy, they've read your policy, they've spoken to staff, and they're looking at your processes, your recording of significant incidents, and it's not aligning, and they might be thinking, hang on a minute, there could be a breach here, so we need to gather a lot of evidence so that we can present this to our team when we're writing our reports. You can ask them that. You can say, is everything okay? Is there a concern that you have about this particular area? Is there something that we can do now while we're together on site, or in the next few days, to make this easier, to make this better, to demonstrate that we're open and sort of willing to drive improvements? So I would just say keep your eyes and ears open for that particular bit, and hopefully feel able to have that conversation. There is always the option to request a ratings review, which is different to the factual accuracy process. This is only when you think the CQC haven't followed their published processes in terms of making decisions and awarding your particular ratings. So you'll know that your factual accuracy process is usually, it's sent with your draft report, and you have 10 working days to respond. This can be done within 15 days of your final report being published. And that's when, and it's an online form that you complete, and you have 500 words that you need to submit to demonstrate why you think the ratings review hasn't been accurate or hasn't been proportionate. And it's during that time that you might want to give additional evidence in this particular topic that could help with the ratings review. So hopefully that's a little bit of information there about proportionality. If we move on to the next slide, please, this is looking at subjectivity. So a question that we've had is, are inspectors only looking for evidence of a type that they've been told to, or can they make their own judgment on what is sufficient evidence? So unfortunately, the answer here is essentially a little bit of both. The CQC are clear that to form a judgment and a score that contribute to a rating, the information they provide is a guide rather than an exhaustive description. So the information that's out there for the key questions, for the quality statements, and looking at the fundamental standards, they are never ever completely descriptive. They are just a guide, their guidance for you to then interpret and understand and implement yourself. So one example that we've picked today is looking at safeguarding. So that's quality statement number 3 under the key question of safe. And hopefully for most of us on the call, safeguarding is something that we feel relatively confident in terms of demonstrating compliance with. It's quite a straightforward sort of process to follow, particularly if you do experience low levels of safeguarding alerts. When you look on the CQC website, there are in fact then 27 links for best practice guidance, and there's also 17 pieces of legislation that it's aligned with. So when we think about it like that, that's a huge amount of information to absorb. There's no way that a provider is going to be up to date with all of those pieces of guidance, all of those pieces of legislation. It's a huge ask, but it's there for you to have a look at, it's there for you to tap into. So what I've done here for you is, and it'd be interesting if people can use the chat function, just a bit of a question for you. The information that's in bold, in the black italic bold in the middle of this slide, what I'd like to hear from you is whether or not you think that's a description of safeguarding as a quality statement overall, a description of what the CQC have published that good looks like, or what they've said that outstanding looks like. So if we think about safeguarding, they're expecting to see a comprehensive safeguarding system, clear roles and responsibilities, making sure that safeguarding risks are proactively identified, that the safeguarding approach includes the empowerment of people, that you work proactively to promote people's safety, the whole team is engaged in reviewing and improving safeguarding, and that you work in line with the MCA principles. So let's see if anybody's comment what they think. Thank you. So one person thinks that this is a description of what good looks like. Another person, Claire's, also thinking the same thing. Does anybody else have any? If you read that, would you say outstanding? Okay, thank you. See, outstanding. Good. Okay, brilliant. That's really helpful. So this is actually an example of what outstanding looks like. So the draft characteristics that were recently published by the CQC, those are what you would need to demonstrate in order to achieve outstanding under safe. So this, for me, this is interesting because for those who have said good, I probably, if I was reviewing this independently, I might have said that to me that's good because that's compliant. To me, that's meeting or demonstrating that you have an understanding of safeguarding, that you are keeping people safe from harm, and that you're empowering people in terms of risk taking and their safety and well-being. So the fact that it's outstanding hopefully means that a lot of you can achieve this. It's not sort of out of this world for those things to be considered and implemented within the practice. And as you'll know from previous webinars, when we've talked about the 3 Ps that we look for during a CQC inspection, so personnel, so your workforce, people who receive care, and your processes, and you consider the evidence examples, all of those above, they're not exact prescriptions that are given by the CQC or other guidance, but they are ideas of what you should be implementing in order to achieve outstanding. So I, as an inspector, might have looked at all of those. I might have only looked at some. I might have looked at different ones. So Sian, so that is outstanding. So I suppose the point there is that actually I might consider that good as an inspector, but the draft characteristics that the CQC have published have told us that that's what outstanding looks like. So subjectivity and what inspectors are looking for to make a judgment, it's a difficult one to capture. That's why the draft characteristics are really important for you to have access to. I think we can probably attach them as part, we can send them out as part of this, after this webinar when people receive the slides. They are available in the public domain, but it would be easy if we can share that with you. You can have a read of those yourselves and make yourself familiar with them. So that's, oh, if that was good, what would outstanding look like? Oh, I see. Sorry, Sian, misinterpreted your question. Well, no, so the point is as an inspector, I would then have to go back and make myself aware of these in a little bit more detail. So I would be using the draft characteristics as an inspector too. And hopefully that's what the inspector should be doing. So they can look at information, they can form a judgment, but they should be using the same guidelines, the same information that's out there across the country and between providers and between inspectors. And it's also then something that you as a provider could challenge. So you could say, well, you've rated us good under this particular area. However, we do all of these, we're confident with them and we've got evidence for them. Therefore, we think we're outstanding. And you can then request a ratings review or challenge that during the factual accuracy process. So I think it's a difficult one to answer in a very concrete way in terms of, do you look for what you've been told to, or can you make your own judgment? Because essentially the answer is a little bit of both. Where is the chart used for the award? Is that, I think if we're referring to the characteristics of this description, it's a Word document. So we'll send it out with after this webinar as well, with when you get the slides. So it's not a very sort of concrete answer, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how it can differ across people's viewpoints, people's opinions, but equally the importance of you having access to the documents in order to then effectively challenge and for you to work towards. So if we move to the next slide, please, this is looking at the topic of inconsistency. So how can you challenge inconsistency in inspections if you know that neighbouring practices have been inspected differently? Okay, so this is also very slightly, it's not a clean-cut answer for this one either, unfortunately, but the main thing to remember here is that you're only likely to want to challenge inconsistency if you feel it's resulted in a negative experience for your workforce or doesn't accurately reflect your views of the service. Because remember that when you challenge ratings during the factual accuracy or the ratings review process, it can go down just as equally as it can go up. So you want to be very mindful of what it is that you're challenging and why. So some ideas that we've talked about at the well-led provider and things that as an inspector we would look to encourage is to build relationships with your neighbouring GP practices, which actually is in line with a number of the quality statements that are already embedded into the single assessment framework. So looking at how you work together, looking at your partnerships and communities, and trying to build those relationships with the registered managers, with the practice managers. And Gary might have some thoughts later on sort of how easy that is. You know, is it a straightforward process to just build relationships with fellow practice managers in the local, to start sharing tips and discuss evidence gathering? So for example, you know, looking at sharing best practice with areas such as training, the use of staff wellbeing initiatives, and any inspection feedback. So if you know that a GP practice has recently had an inspection, reach out to them, find out how it went, see if they're having a debrief or a team meeting where they're gathering all of the information. See if one of your representatives can attend that meeting and then feed back to your practice so that you can take some lessons from that. When your CQC inspection is announced, is it worth seeing if anybody from that practice is available to come over and support you and explain how that was done to help you with the process? So yeah, that's always something that, and you know, from a CQC perspective, that would be looked upon in a positive light for building relationships. Another thought is to empower your staff to think like an inspector, to get in the mind of an inspector. And an example is that I'm currently working with an adult social care charity, and I will be shadowing these. So this is slightly different, and I quite like this approach, is rather than me going in to do a mock inspection independently, what I'll actually be doing is shadowing the existing quality team. So they themselves do the quality audits, you know, we'll all be familiar with that, sort of going around the services and using their own internal framework. And I will be almost having an induction with them. So I'll be one step behind, looking at their process and what they do. And then I will be able to provide them with any tips or suggestions or ideas of how to change their internal processes. Hopefully that means that you know, that allows, that sort of gives them some longevity with their own internal approach. And it also means that we can both come together to make sure that they're thinking in line with CQC requirements, and yeah, that they feel more confident to challenge any inconsistencies or issues that have arisen during the inspection. So yeah, if you can think of ideas, think outside the box to get in the mind of an inspector, then that might sort of support your workforce to feel more ready and feel more empowered during that process. We've also got an extract from the DASH report that sort of acknowledging the inconsistency. So the DASH report that came out last year, that it seems that most data considered is drawn from national surveys, which may or may not be representative or statistically significant at service level. And it's then supplemented by a number of interviews with service users. So essentially what we're saying here is that and as I mentioned sort of earlier in an earlier slide, GP practices and providers, you must have an understanding of how ratings are calculated. So understanding who's been spoken to, what data has been reviewed, what's been looked at. So, you know, from a proportionality point of view, how has that been calculated? And you can then use that data to challenge. Otherwise, it might feel quite impossible to change them or to challenge the ratings. So part of this will involve asking the inspector during the process, what have you used to form a judgment or particular areas, and then make a note of it. If, as per the DASH report, they're only using national surveys and they're not speaking to a high number or a fair number of people at a local level, and they're not looking at the local data that you gather, then it isn't necessarily going to be a consistent approach or a proportionate approach, or a fair approach. So it's important that you take a note of that. Again, we've referenced before, always try to read and access similar reports during your inspection. So looking at practices that have been inspected in the local area, and they've had their reports published, to see if you can extract any meaningful data from that. And then we've also got you've always got the factual accuracy and the to have a look through. And just to make sure, remind you that there is a difference between a factual accuracy and a complaint. So the complaint is the approach that was taken by the inspector rather than the detail that's provided in the report. You may feel that it's both are warranted, but they are there for you to help you. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, which is a question: what do inspectors hate? So again, quite a heated question, but what I would say is that the main caveat here is that the word hate does mean to feel an intense dislike, or a dislike for something. And the role of the CQC is not to dislike or to even like something, which, the next question is, what do inspectors love? They're not here to love, they're not here to hate, like or dislike. They're simply here to ensure that the quality and the safety of the services across England are working well. So are patients safe? Are your workforce supported? Are things working effectively? Are you responsive? And as a management team, are you well led? So I would try to, if you do feel that you've got an inspector that is coming in with a love or hate relationship for your service, they're having sort of favoritisms or strong dislikes for something, I would try really hard to use some of the tips that we've spoken about earlier to challenge that, because that's really not what the CQC are here for. So there are some things that providers that you could do to make it more difficult for an inspector to understand how you're running. And again, we've spoken about these a little bit in the past, but some things that I personally didn't enjoy as an inspector was a lack of detail or transparency in response to a question. That's very much about the attack and defense approach. So if we're asking a question, it's simply because we don't know the answer. Okay, it's very unlikely that it's a load where we've already decided the outcome or we've decided the answer. We're not looking to trip you up. We simply just don't know. So we're asking you the question. If we say, how many complaints have you had in the last quarter? It's not have you had loads of complaints and does everybody dislike you? It's genuinely just what's going on with your complaints process so that we can report fairly on it. So they're looking for further information, and it's not a you versus us. It's simply an opportunity to understand something. So hopefully just the more open and honest you can be, the better that you will be at having that conversation back and forth. I think a lack of curiosity or engagement. So, inspectors come with their own skill set, their own, as we've mentioned earlier, they might have done additional training, they might have different backgrounds, different experience, but you yourselves are also experts in your own particular area. So make the most of having an inspector available, ask them as many questions as you'd like. And the more that we ask, feel free to ask questions back. So keep that going. It will allow both sides of the party to learn. and come to a joint conclusion about whether or not something is or isn't working. So an example of that is recently I was doing a mock inspection for a healthcare provider, and we were looking at their audit process, and they had plans to do sort of an audit of the audits with an overarching audit. So the word audit was being overused, and we probably spent about half an hour talking to each other about this, trying to get to the bottom of exactly what the head of compliance was looking for. What did they want to achieve by implementing this new system? Was it that they were scared that they weren't going to be demonstrating compliance to the CQC? Did they not have assurance of the audits that already existed? So we went back and forth. I asked them questions, they asked me questions. And like I said, it took a long time, but we got there. And in the end, we worked out exactly what document they needed to create in order to have assurance from a good governance point of view. So that engagement proved to be useful for both of us. I think taking accountability, so where gaps are identified, see it as a chance to improve, and if possible, start to make during the inspection rather than waiting for everything to be over. So try not to be closed off to new ideas or new suggestions. If they, if you, as I mentioned earlier, if you're picking up that they are sensing that something isn't quite right, something's not going well, have that conversation with them and say, okay, let me work on that in the next couple of days, and I'll get back to you with what we've done. Could you have a look at it then? Or, that should then be reported on during the report. So, during the inspection, the provider responded to this. We have assurance that they will be looking at this. So it should have a positive impact from a ratings and reporting perspective. Again, I've talked about this before, but being left alone or stopping business as usual doesn't usually go down too well, because an inspector really is there to see business as usual. So if you have got team meetings, if you're doing a fire drill that day, if you're testing the panic alarms for clinicians in their rooms, go ahead and do it. Don't cancel things on behalf of us. Keep going, because we need to see what things look like on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, an example is that a recent GP inspection that I did had planned to do safety checks of all of the alarms in response to an incident that had happened. And they had told us that they would postpone it because we were visiting. But I recommended they do it anyway, and as a result we were able to report positively on when we spoke to staff about safety, about well-being, about the policies and processes, thinking about inductions. So there was a huge amount that we were able to report on just from that one particular task that they were doing. I can see there's a question, so I will come back to that. I've just got a couple more slides and then I will come back to that one if that's okay. So if we move on to the next slide, please. What do inspectors love? Again, I've just sort of done a caveat here about the word love, looking at intense feelings and deep affection, very much not what the CQC is there to do. So if you ever get a feeling that, that those feelings are there, then that's something I would challenge. But there are things that we can do that make life more positive, make life easier, and make the whole experience more positive and more productive. So firstly, to include the inspector, make sure you're showing us around, introducing to everyone who works there. Don't just walk past rooms where there might be staff that you don't think were interested in meeting, or we don't really go in there very often, or they only work because you hear things like they only work part-time, or they're new, so you don't need to speak to them. We want to see it all. So we want to meet everybody and anybody at all levels, working in any capacity with skill sets in every area, because it takes a village to run a service. It's not just the registered manager, the practice manager, the nominated individual. It's not just the doctors, it's everybody that we need to be speaking to. So include us in the whole experience from the moment that we sort of enter the practice or enter the service. Being honest, please be honest. Usually at the beginning, when I do an inspection, I say to them what's not going well and what's going well, so I can find out straight away what their thoughts are, and that will also help me sort of do a little bit of a deeper dive into particular areas. But yeah, if it's not working, please just tell us. It's more important that we know than that you hide. I have to say that if you hide things, often an inspector will find it anyway, and you haven't been transparent and open with things that are going wrong. So I've got And then the last sort of tip was copying good ideas from other people. So there's absolutely no shame. And in fact, it is a positive thing that's reflected in the quality statements about partnership working, that if an inspector sees you spending time researching best practice and incorporating these, then it's absolutely a good thing. So a recent example of a GP practice that were rated outstanding in the key question responsive, and they scored 4 in the equity and access quality statement. And that was because arrangements had been made for patients who could not access the electronic system from home. Following the implementation of the electronic patient systems, the practice reviewed these systems, and a member of staff with qualifications in the field of digital health had helped to evolve the system. So I think that's a really nice example of, you're not gatekeeping particular projects to particular staff members. You know, it's, if you've got somebody who has a skill set, they might be working, let's say they're the facilities manager, but actually they have got a side qualification or a side passion in digital health. Include them and bring them on board so that we can see that you're working in a really holistic and inclusive manner, you know, and taking as many good ideas from other people as you can in order to get the best outcomes. So yeah, those are my few top tips for what would an inspector love. We've had a few questions put to us sort of in the last few days as well, that I will run through very quickly. I'm mindful of time. So how many, so the received this week is, how many years is a DBS certificate considered to be valid? So a DBS has no official expiry date. You don't need to do DBSs every 3 years. That's something that's come about over the years, and people, you know, it seems to have stuck, but it's not written down anywhere. So any information included will only be accurate at the time that the check was carried out anyway. If they're on the auto enroll system, you can keep an eye on that, but it's for you to decide if and when a new check is needed, and you need to be risk assessing alongside those decisions that you're making. So provide evidence that you've considered where new checks are needed and risk assess in line with that. But there is no official expiry date for a DBS. Staff handbooks. Okay, I mean, I could do a whole webinar on staff handbooks, but there is some really good information actually on the CQC website for this. And it's actually under the Mythbuster, looking at induction packs, which an induction pack and a staff handbook sort of would come together. Essentially, yeah. Can we go to the next slide? Is that for? Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. We'll come back to the Q&A. Oh no, sorry, we're on that slide now. Sorry, Claire. Okay, yeah. Sorry, everybody. I think my chat's slightly delayed. So the staff handbooks are essentially, they're a good way for a new starter to understand the visions, the values, the makes up your workforce, and any information that might be beneficial for them, such as safety and wellbeing initiatives, you know, leave management, fire safety, how to access support. And in line with the second question about policies and procedures, yes and no. So it's unlikely that you would attach every single policy and procedure that you have to a staff handbook or an induction pack for a new starter. In this day and age, it's very unlikely that you're printing these things off anyway. And you don't want somebody to come on board and have to read. I mean, every policy and procedure together would be thousands of pages, probably hundreds of pages. So it's unlikely that you're going to give somebody a massive wad of information to read. It wouldn't go down well. So you certainly need to be including a link to them. So where can they access all of the policies and procedures? And you might benefit from sort of staging those out into stage 1s, 2s and 3s. So priority policies to read, you know, during your first week, weeks 2 and 3, these policies, week 4, this policy, so that over the month they've had a chance to digest them. Otherwise it will be policy overload, and that would then go against the idea of a healthy and sort of meaningful induction, because they wouldn't take everything in. Prioritise policies such as the consent policy, your equality and human rights, looking at governance and IPC, medicines and safe, certainly your statement of purpose, freedom to speak up, thinking about risk management, significant events, complaints, and then anything such as whistleblowing or information governance as well. So there are a number of policies that I prioritise. If you need more information on that, feel free to reach out to us at the Well-Led Provider and we'll give you sort of a few more hints and tips. But that's probably the best way to go about it. And then the last question is, what questions are directed at practice nurses specifically? So in short, I would say exactly the same that they would ask any other staff member, because they are looking at the effectiveness of the service in line with the fundamental standards. So they'll want to speak to a practice nurse about how was your induction? What was the quality of the induction? What support do you receive from your leadership team? If you're line managing other nurses or receiving support from a head of nursing, for example, how does that look? Do you have time for training? Then they might ask some specific questions such as, can you give an example of a patient safety incident that has recently occurred? How did you identify it or respond to it? Can we see the audits or the record keeping for that? And were there any lessons learnt? They might ask how their role, do they have any additional roles to contribute towards improvements in patient care? So any ideas they've had that have been heard and responded to from the leadership team, or that they themselves have initiated. The CQC may ask for them to present a complex clinical case. They might ask them to do that in line with the doctor as well, so together, and looking at how they worked in partnership to manage that particular case. And they'll want to sort of understand their knowledge on NICE guidance and the RCN guidance as well. So just making sure that they're up to date with the best practice guidance in line with their registration as a nurse. I've talked a lot, but hopefully that's useful. And I will now hand over to the rest of the team and have a look at the questions as well.
Thanks, Gabby. I think for the interest of time, there might be Renee's question that you might be able to answer, which is picking up on the DBS thing. Can you clarify about not needing a DBS renewed every 3 years? Are you able to do that, Gabby?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, you just don't. I can send you the link. In fact, I will do it right now while we're talking, but you just don't. That is a myth that's come about over the years. And often what happens is that providers will bulk buy policies, sort of policies that pre-exist, and that will be written into the policies and not bespoke to your service. But you just don't need to. A DBS has no official expiry date. That's just the kind of the key statement. So you can make that decision at your service level about what you want to do for that. And I will attach the DBS link.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you. That's really helpful. And Ross, I've copied your question and we will respond to you sort of privately afterwards, if that's okay, just for the interest of time. But I promise we will respond to you. And Gabby's put that mythbuster in there about DBS checks. Let me just run through quickly what we do at the Well-Led Provider. If we just go to the next slide, Claire. We specifically have a piece of software to help you with your well-led compliance. You'll have your policies and procedures already, but as Gabby has sort of reflected on, you also need to show that your policies and procedures are working. And the way that you do that with the well-led, because you can't do audits of your clinical system to know if your staff are happy, is by seeking feedback from staff. So our software allows you to do that and to get some good data from them, hopefully to show to the CQC that you are indeed well led. But if there's an area that you need to be working on, then we also have a lot of resources on our platform for you to do that improvement work yourselves without needing to get an expert in. Next slide, please, Claire. And again, next slide, please. I'm just running through these quickly, and of course you will get them afterwards anyway. And next slide again. But as well as our software, we also offer some services too. So we can come and do something bespoke with you, facilitate an away day, for example. Gary does a lot of that work. We have workshops that we can come in and do, and Gabby can do mock CQC inspections, either a full one or a more targeted one in one day. And I work as a mediator too, so I sometimes will come into practices and help you if you've got some conflict in your practice that you need support with. Next slide, Claire. And next slide again. Our next webinar next month, we have Gabby back in the sort of hot seat doing most of the work in the webinar, and she will take you through an inspection from start to finish from the point of view of an inspector, rather than, as we all know what it's like as a provider, but she'll talk you through the whole process from a kind of CQC inspector point of view. And then towards the end of March, we also have a separate webinar where we'll be talking about the new 25-26 GP contract, as it should be announced by then, what to expect, how you might prepare for it, and any risks that it might pose to your practices and PCN. And we're doing that in partnership with Hempson's, the medical legal firm, and MyAB, the insurer. Those links, when you get the slides through, you'll be able to click on and register, but you will get the links emailed to you anyway, and you'll be invited to join the webinars. I'll now hand over to Mohammed from the Medicines Management team, the sponsors of the webinar, to talk you through what the Medicines Management team can offer to practices and PCNs.
Thank you, Claire.